man to a living legend. But what exactly did Jasmine say in those few minutes that shattered his silence and resurrected a dream he thought was already dead? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The dressing room reeked of stale air and regret. A single flickering bulb hung overhead, casting Steve Harvey's silhouette into a long, broken shadow against the peeling wall. Steve's suit, once tailored to perfection, now slumped across his body like a defeated flag. On the small table beside him, his phone vibrated endlessly. News outlets, agents, so-called friends, all demanding explanations, apologies, performances. Steve Harvey didn't move. He didn't answer. He stared blankly at the floor, the noise outside muffled into a sickening hum. The headlines still screamed in his mind. Harvey's catastrophic Miss Universe blunder. Is this the end of Steve Harvey? The memory twisted inside him like a knife. Standing on that glittering stage, envelope in hand, the world watching, then the sickening drop in his gut as he realized he had said the wrong name. He could still hear the gas, the confused applause turning to horrified murmurs, the crowned queen's stunned smile freezing into panic. Cameras flashed like gunfire, capturing the single moment that would define him for millions of people. Not decades of struggle, not years of climbing from nothing, but a single slip, a single mistake played over and over again on every screen in America. A tightness gripped his chest, colder and sharper than anything he had felt on the streets during his homeless years. Maybe they were right. Maybe all the years of scraping, bleeding, laughing through tears had led to nothing but this final humiliation. Maybe he was done. In the corner of the room, tucked inside a cracked leather portfolio, an old photograph slipped out. Weathered, creased at the edges. Steve reached for it with a hand that trembled more from the weight of memory than exhaustion. The photo captured him at 22, standing on a milk crate in a dingy comedy club, clutching a borrowed microphone like a lifeline. His eyes back then burned with something fierce, something reckless, a belief that the world, no matter how brutal, could not kill his dream. Now under the ghostly hum of the light, that same photo felt like a cruel relic from a past he no longer belonged to. His throat tightened. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped him before collapsing into a sigh so heavy it seemed to pull the very air out of the room. Maybe it was all just luck, he muttered to no one, his voice barely more than a breath. Maybe my time's up. But as Steve Harvey sat there drowning in silence, staring at a future that seemed already written in dust, a timid knock at the door broke through the fog. The door creaked open, and Marcus, Steve Harvey's longtime assistant, poked his head in. He wasn't carrying a script or a statement to release to the press. He was carrying a flyer, slightly crumpled, still smelling of fresh ink. "Boss," Marcus said quietly, like he was approaching a wounded animal. "There's this event tonight, a justice forum downtown. Jasmine Crockett's hosting it." The name barely registered through the roar in Steve's head. Justice? What justice? His mind spat the word back like poison. Justice didn't save him when the world turned his honest mistake into a public execution. Justice didn't stop the headlines from slicing him open like a butcher working a side of meat. Still, Marcus pressed the flyer into his hands. "Just go. Get out of this room before it eats you alive," he said, voice trembling with something dangerously close to pity. Steve glanced at the paper, not because he cared, but because staring at it was easier than staring at his own ruins. An hour later, Steve Harvey sat slouched in the back seat of a black town car, arms crossed, jaw tight, glaring at the blurred city lights outside. He hadn't even changed clothes. The same wrinkled, battle-scarred suit clung to him like old sins. He wasn't walking toward hope. He was just walking away from the wreckage. The streets of downtown pulsed with life, but inside the car, the silence between him and Marcus was suffocating. Every bump in the road jostled the flyer on the seat beside him, the words justice and dreams taunting him with their bright, meaningless hope. Steve had no faith in justice anymore, and he sure as hell didn't believe in dreams. Still, something ugly and stubborn inside him had dragged him into the car anyway. A ghost of the man he used to be, refusing to lie down and die. He told himself he would sit in the back of the room, arms folded, face stone cold, and let it all wash over him like static. He wasn't going to listen. He wasn't going to care. He just needed to escape the dressing room before it crushed what little he had left. The car barely rolled to a stop before Steve Harvey stepped out, pulling his baseball cap low over his eyes like a man slipping into enemy territory. The grand hall loomed ahead, a cathedral of ambition wrapped in polished marble and glass. Inside, the seats were packed shoulder to shoulder with young faces, eager, hungry, burning with a kind of hope Steve Harvey had almost forgotten existed. Their chatter buzzed like electric current, a thousand tiny sparks of dreams colliding in the stale air. Steve kept his head down, weaving through the aisles like a ghost, the brim of his cap shadowing the tired lines etched deep into his face. He chose a seat near the back, half swallowed by darkness, close enough to the exit if the air got too heavy again. No one recognized him, or if they did, they said nothing, leaving him to drown in the luxury of his own invisibility. The stage was bare except for a single podium and a muted backdrop emblazoned with three words in bold letters: Justice and Dreams. Steve snorted under his breath, the words tasting like ash. In a world that had judged him guilty for a slip of the tongue, justice felt like a joke nobody was brave enough to laugh at. The lights dimmed without warning, and the restless murmur of the crowd died as if a switch had been thrown. From the side of the stage, Jasmine Crockett emerged, not in glittering robes or grand fanfare, but in a simple black suit sharp enough to cut glass. No jewelry, no flourish, no practiced smiles. Just a woman carved out of pure intent, her stride steady, unhurried, as if she owned the weight of every eye in the room without needing their permission. Her gaze swept across the audience like a searchlight, cool and measured, daring anyone to look away first. There was no false modesty in her posture, no need to shrink herself to fit anyone's expectations. She moved to the podium with the calm of someone who had survived bigger battles than this one, battles that had never made the evening news. The silence thickened, heavy and real, as if the room itself held its breath. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to say a word. Her presence locked the crowd in place. From his seat in the shadows, Steve Harvey felt a dull ache stir inside him, a distant, almost forgotten memory of what true conviction looked like. It wasn't pride or sadness. It was something older. Raw. Watching her stand so sure, he realized how far he had fallen from the man he once was. Then Jasmine Crockett leaned into the microphone, not with force, but with the quiet certainty of someone who carried too many unspoken stories. She didn't pull out a sheet of paper. She didn't rattle off statistics or legal jargon. She simply looked out at the crowd and spoke, her voice low but steady, each word landing with the weight of something lived, not studied. We talk about dreams like there's some shiny thing you pick up when you're ready, but let me tell you, dreams are heavy. Dreams have scars. You don't hear about the ones who chased a dream and lost everything. The worker who clocked in for 30 years and still got laid off without warning. You don't hear about the girl who fought her way into college, only to drown in debt so deep she couldn't breathe. You don't hear about the mother who stands in courtrooms with shaking hands, trying to prove she deserves to keep the children she already raised with nothing but love and prayers. Justice isn't a marble building. It isn't a robe and a gavel. Justice is fought in small kitchens where mothers skip meals so their kids don't go hungry. It's fought in back alley offices where students sign loans that feel more like life sentences. It's fought at kitchen tables where families decide whether to pay rent or buy medicine. And dreams, real dreams, they don't float. They crawl. They bleed. I'm not here to tell you it's fair. It's not. I'm not here to tell you it gets easier. It doesn't. I'm here to tell you, if you are still standing, if you are still breathing, if you are still daring to want something more, then you are already stronger than anything that has ever tried to break you. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't pound the podium. She simply let the silence do the shouting for her. Each story she named felt like it belonged to someone in the room, like it was being pulled out from under the skin. People shifted in their seats, not out of discomfort, but because the truth sat too heavy on their chest to ignore. Steve Harvey, hidden near the back, felt it too, the slow, painful unraveling of every excuse he had made for giving up. This wasn't a speech. It was a mirror. And in it, Steve didn't see the polished, exhausted celebrity the world knew. He saw a boy once standing on a milk crate, holding a borrowed microphone like it was the last thing keeping him alive. And just when it seemed the weight of her words might crush the room entirely, Jasmine Crockett paused, lifting her eyes to meet every broken dream staring back at her. She held their gaze. No notes, no crutches, standing alone under the harsh lights like a fighter who refused to flinch. She let the silence press against their ribs, let it pull the air tight until the whole room ached for release. Then she spoke, steady, deliberate, each syllable cutting clean through the noise in their heads. "Your failure," she said, her voice low but ringing clear, "is not your funeral. It's your fertilizer." For a heartbeat, the world held its breath with him. The words detonated in the room, louder than any shout. Somewhere up front, someone exhaled sharply, almost a gasp. Steve Harvey didn't move. For half a second, he couldn't move. It hit him with a force that felt physical, like a punch square to the ribs that left his lungs grasping for air. His hands, limp at first, jerked into fists, tightening hard enough that the old ache in his knuckles flared sharp and bright. He tried to swallow it down. The wave of old failures, old humiliations, old wounds he thought he'd buried under laughter and work and glittering stages. But Jasmine's words had yanked them out into the open, raw and unhidden. He wasn't thinking about Miss Universe anymore. He wasn't thinking about the tabloids or the jokes or the pitying looks. He was thinking about the boy who once slept in a car with nothing but a ripped jacket for warmth, the man who stood on a milk crate in a dive bar because no one else would give him a stage. He was thinking about how easily the world had convinced him that one mistake erased all of that. That one stumble was a gravestone for everything he had fought for. But Jasmine's voice cracked through the shame like sunlight through broken glass, scattering it. She hadn't dressed her words up to make them easier to swallow. She had spoken them rough and real, like they were meant to bruise. Steve's chest tightened, but it wasn't the old despair curling there. It was something heavier, older, and stubborn as hell. A forgotten kind of anger, a buried kind of pride. Somewhere deep inside, under the exhaustion and the fear, a piece of him sat up and remembered itself. And in that searing, silent moment, Steve Harvey realized he wasn't finished. Not yet. And before Steve Harvey could even catch his breath, Jasmine's words dragged him backward through time, ripping open a memory he had tried for years to bury. It was a night stitched together by cold rain and the low, rattling cough of a dying engine. Steve Harvey sat curled in the back seat of his battered 1976 Ford Tempo, a thin, torn jacket pulled up to his chin like a shield against the freezing dark. Water leaked steadily through the cracked door seals, soaking the threadbare carpet, turning the floor into a swamp of misery. Outside, the storm hammered the metal roof with a relentless fury, each drop a fist pounding against his failure. Inside, Steve shivered violently, the breath from his mouth rising in thin, desperate clouds that vanished as quickly as they came. Hunger gnawed at him, cruel and patient. But colder still was the humiliation. The knowledge that somewhere, not far away, warm homes were filled with light, laughter, and lives he could no longer touch. He shifted under the useless jacket, joints stiff, body aching from too many nights like this. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. Not from the cold, not from the shame. The world outside didn't even know he was here. And worse, it wouldn't have cared if it did. As the rainstorm of memory lashed harder against him, another wound surfaced, just as raw. The night Steve Harvey first tasted what it meant to stand alone under the lights and be torn apart. The spotlight had been blinding, hot against Steve's sweaty forehead, as he clutched the microphone with both hands like it might save him. His voice, shaky but hopeful, cracked jokes into the smoky haze of the tiny club, desperate for laughter, for anything. Instead, he was met with a wall of indifference that quickly curdled into open hostility. Booing started somewhere in the middle, a low, ugly rumble that rolled forward like a gathering storm. Someone shouted from the back, sharp, cruel words Steve couldn't make out but felt like slaps anyway. Another plastic cup sailed past his ear and shattered against the floor, spraying his worn-out shoes with warm beer. His throat closed up. His hands went numb. A man near the front stood up and pointed at him, laughing openly, and the laughter caught like dry grass on fire. Steve forced one last joke out, a limp, half-hearted punchline, and when it fell dead against the rising tide of jeers, he dropped the mic and stumbled off stage into the suffocating dark, gut-burning with shame. Nobody stopped him. Nobody cared. That night, the world didn't just tell him he had failed. It told him he didn't even belong. But just as the memory of failure threatened to drown him completely, another memory rose, fiercer, softer, the voice of the one person who had never let him forget who he was. It was late, long past midnight, when Steve Harvey stumbled back into the house, soaked with rain, carrying nothing but the heavy stink of humiliation on his skin. The living room was dark, silent, except for the faint buzz of the old refrigerator humming in the kitchen. He thought he could slip by unnoticed, drag himself to his room, bury his shame under a pillow. But there she was, his mother, waiting at the worn kitchen table, her hands folded tight, her eyes shining under the dim yellow light overhead. She didn't scold him. She didn't ask a single question. She just looked at him, really looked at him, the way only a mother could, seeing every crack in the armor he had tried to wear. Without a word, she reached out and took his hand, rough and calloused from years of scrubbing floors and stretching pennies into meals. Her fingers squeezed his with a strength that felt out of place in such a small, tired woman. Steve stood there stiff, fighting the sting behind his eyes, desperate not to collapse in front of her. She pulled him closer until he had no choice but to meet her gaze, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low but unshakable. "Steve, God gave you that gift. You don't give up on it, not for them, not for anyone." The words struck deeper than anything he had heard on any stage. They carved straight through the layers of shame, the bruises of that brutal night, the roar of laughter that had chased him off the stage like a hunted man. He felt them settle inside him like anchors, heavy but sure, pulling him back from the edge of surrender. His throat tightened until he could barely breathe. His eyes blurred until he could hardly see her, but he refused to let the tears fall, refused to let the storm inside him break loose. His mother's hand stayed firm around his, a lifeline holding him upright when every bone in his body wanted to give up. In that small, cracked kitchen, with the rain still pounding the windows, Steve Harvey understood something that no amount of success or failure would ever erase. He was not built to quit. He was not made to disappear. He was born to fight. And that fight wasn't over yet. It didn't feel like hope. It felt like pain. The sudden, brutal kind you get when a numb limb starts to wake up. Steve Harvey sat frozen, the words hanging in the air, heavier than anything he could fight or outrun. Your failure is not your funeral. It's your fertilizer. For a moment, all he could do was breathe in the hurt he had spent years packing into the cracks of his chest. His hands, cramped from clenching too long, twitched open on his lap. Shame, rage, exhaustion. They all tangled up inside him, thrashing for space, refusing to stay buried any longer. For so long, Steve had accepted the world's verdict. That one mistake had written his whole story in stone. But Jasmine's voice cut through the noise, and for the first time, he didn't feel like the sum of his failures. He felt like something cracked but alive, something messy and furious and real. His heart slammed once, hard against his ribs, a warning shot to the part of him that had almost stopped caring. Steve Harvey wasn't whole, he wasn't fixed, but he wasn't dead either. Not yet. The words still rang inside him long after Jasmine left the stage, and Steve Harvey stayed in his seat, gripping the edges of the chair like a man holding himself back from running. Only this time, it wasn't fear that anchored him. It was something heavier, something harder to name. The crowd buzzed back to life as the lights came up, young voices crackling with energy and sharp ambition. People laughed, clapped, filtered toward the exits in small, excited clusters. But Steve didn't move. He sat hunched forward, cap still pulled low, letting the tide of bodies pass him by. His heart was pounding now, slow and deep, like a drum beat he couldn't silence. His fingers drummed an uneven rhythm against his thigh, nerves sparking under his skin. Part of him screamed to leave, to disappear into the night before this new fragile feeling could break under the weight of reality. But another part, older, rougher, more stubborn, kept him pinned there, eyes locked on the side of the stage where Jasmine had vanished. He waited until the last of the crowd thinned out, until the rows of chairs stood mostly empty under the dimmed house lights before finally forcing his legs to move. His knees cracked when he stood, and for a moment he just breathed, hands trembling slightly at his sides, before he began the slow, deliberate walk toward the stage. The backstage area was nothing fancy. Folding chairs, half-drunk bottles of water, a battered sign taped to the wall with Jasmine Crockett's name scrawled across it in thick black ink. She was there, near the edge of the platform, speaking quietly to a few volunteers. She looked smaller without the lights blasting down on her, almost ordinary. But the weight she carried around her didn't shrink at all. It moved with her, a quiet force that filled the space without needing permission. Steve hesitated at the edge of the light, hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his wrinkled jacket, feeling more like a boy outside a locked door than the man who had once commanded stadiums. He opened his mouth twice before any sound came out. When he finally stepped forward, it felt like pushing through concrete. Jasmine turned before he spoke, as if she had already sensed him standing there. Her expression didn't change. She didn't frown. She didn't smile. She just waited, patient, steady, holding the silence open like a door wide enough for him to walk through if he dared. Steve stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the worn lines at the corners of her eyes, the slight smudge of exhaustion under them. He tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat, tight and jagged. For a long second, he just stood there, swallowing against the burn behind his eyes until the truth cracked out of him in a voice so rough it didn't even sound like his own. "I thought I was finished," he said, the words barely louder than a whisper, but carrying the weight of every year he had spent running from that fear. The air between them seemed to hum, thick with things unspoken. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't reach for platitudes or empty comforts. Instead, she stepped forward, closing the distance with slow, deliberate calm, and laid a single hand on Steve's shoulder. It wasn't heavy, barely more than a touch, but it landed with the force of a vow. Her palm was steady, her fingers strong, and when she spoke, her voice didn't rise. It dropped lower, deeper, like a river cutting through stone. "You're just in halftime, Mr. Harvey," she said, a small, knowing smile flickering at the corner of her mouth. "Champions rise after the break." The words struck harder than any standing ovation he had ever received. Harder than any insult hurled across a smoky comedy club. Harder than any headline splashed across a screen. They didn't lift him. They didn't praise him. They didn't lie. They simply told the truth the way he used to believe truth should be told. Plain, brutal, and stitched with hope so stubborn it could not be killed. The touch on his shoulder burned into him, not like fire, but like life. It shot straight down his spine, rattling the cage he had built around himself and shaking the locked door loose from its hinges. He hadn't realized how long he had been holding his breath until it escaped him all at once. A long, shuddering exhale that hollowed out his chest and left room for something new to move in. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, uncurled slowly, the tension bleeding away with every beat of his heart. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He wasn't just performing. He wasn't just enduring. He was waking up. The exhaustion was still there. The hurt, the cracks, the regrets, none of it had magically disappeared. But they no longer felt like chains. They felt like roots. They felt like fertilizer, just like Jasmine had said. Everything that had tried to bury him, now waiting to feed whatever he dared to grow next. The road ahead was still dark. The world outside still waited with its knives sharpened. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Steve Harvey didn't want to run from it. He wanted to meet it head on, scars and all. He lifted his head slowly, meeting Jasmine's gaze full on now. No hiding, no flinching. And in that simple, brutal, beautiful moment, he understood exactly what champions were made of. Not victories, not perfection, but breaks, and the stubborn, holy courage to rise after them. The weight of Jasmine's hand had long lifted from his shoulder, but the spark she lit refused to die, still burning low and fierce inside Steve Harvey's chest as he stepped alone into the cold night and carried it home. The old house was too quiet when he returned, the kind of silence that once would have hollowed him out. Tonight it felt different, heavier, but not suffocating. Steve Harvey shrugged off his jacket and tossed the crumpled cap onto a chair, the movements automatic, stripped bare of any ceremony. The walls around him were lined with ghosts, awards, photos, plaques, things that once meant everything and lately had felt like tombstones. He didn't bother turning on the big lights. He left the house in shadows, the way a battlefield looks after the smoke clears, but before the rebuilding begins. In the corner of his study, the battered old desk waited for him, its surface scarred with rings from long-forgotten coffee cups and years of restless, frustrated nights. Steve dragged out the wooden chair, the legs scraping loud against the worn floorboards, and sat down with a slow, deliberate breath. The desk lamp flickered to life, throwing a sharp circle of light across the empty page before him. It was just a notebook, nothing fancy, a cheap spiral-bound, half-used and abandoned after some earlier, failed attempt at planning something that never happened. He stared at the first blank line for a long time, his hand heavy where it hovered over the paper, the pen cold against his fingers. Part of him still whispered that he was wasting his time, that the world outside hadn't changed just because he had breathed a little deeper tonight. That voice was old, too familiar to fight with words anymore, so Steve didn't argue with it. He just pressed the tip of the pen to the page and started to write anyway. At first, the words came slow, awkward, like pulling broken glass out of a wound. But he kept writing. No more hiding behind perfection. No more apologizing for scars. No more shrinking to fit a world that loves your shine, but fears your depth. The pen moved faster, carving out pieces of himself he hadn't touched in years. Every line was a battle cry, every sentence a small war won against the part of him that wanted to stay safe and silent. The anger poured out first. Anger at the people who had abandoned him when it was convenient. Anger at the headlines that had turned him into a punchline. Anger at himself for believing he was only worth the sum of his applause. But underneath the anger came something quieter, something heavier. Forgiveness. Not for them, for himself. Steve Harvey paused, hands trembling slightly above the page. He closed his eyes, dragging in a breath so deep it burned, and when he opened them again, he wrote the words that had been clawing their way toward the surface all night. Every scar is a story. Every fall is a reason to rise stronger. He underlined it once, twice, the ink digging deep into the fibers of the paper like a brand. He sat back, staring at the sentence until it blurred in the halo of the lamplight, feeling it root itself into the bones of him. Steve pushed the notebook aside and stared out the window into the dark, where the city lay sprawled out like a sleeping beast, glittering and dangerous. He knew it hadn't softened while he sat here writing. The world outside didn't care about declarations scribbled at midnight. It would still be waiting for him with claws sharpened, waiting for him to trip again so it could tear him apart. But for the first time in a long time, Steve Harvey didn't feel like running from that fight. He leaned forward, elbows planted firmly on the battered desk, his fingers steepled together under his chin. His body still ached with the weight of all the years he had carried in silence. His chest still bore the hollow places where old dreams had caved in. But somewhere under all of that, something had survived. Something stubborn and savage. Something that refused to stay dead no matter how many times the world tried to bury it. And now, that something was clawing its way back into the light. He didn't know what his comeback would look like. He didn't have a perfect plan or a guaranteed next big break waiting. All he had was the raw, burning certainty that this time he would show up without armor, without polish, without pretending that survival had left him untouched. He would go back to the stage, not to redeem himself, not to win anyone back, but because the fight, the climb, the clawing towards something better was in his blood. Because standing there broken and breathing was already more victory than anyone had ever handed him. Steve turned back to the notebook, flipping to a fresh page, and started sketching out a new plan. Not a 5-year empire, not a media juggernaut, just the next step, just the first truth he would stand up and say. He wrote, "Tell the truth, all of it, The ugly parts, the broken parts, the miracles. He smiled faintly to himself, a real smile this time, not the tight, worn mask he had gotten so good at wearing. The night dragged on, the city pulsing faintly beyond the windows, and Steve kept writing. Ideas, stories, bits of memory he would weave into jokes raw enough to hurt and real enough to heal. He wasn't chasing fame anymore. He wasn't chasing redemption. He was chasing the sound of his own soul breathing again, loud and unafraid. By the time the first weak light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, Steve Harvey sat back in his chair, exhausted, hollowed out, and alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. His notebook lay open in front of him, pages filled with a roadmap built not on survival, but on truth. He rubbed a hand over his face, the rough scrape of his palm against the stubble of his jaw grounding him in the moment. No cameras, no lights, no laughter, just a man and a pen and a choice. To fight, to stand, to rebuild. Not because the world said he could, but because this time, Steve Harvey said he would. When Steve Harvey finally stepped back into the world, he wasn't carrying a script or an apology. He was carrying a storm, fierce and quiet, built from every scar he had refused to hide. The first time he walked onto the set of Family Feud again, the cameras caught something different before he even opened his mouth. It wasn't the trademark smile that fans had come to expect, easy and wide and almost too polished. It wasn't the fast wit, the quick punchlines that once ricocheted across the stage like sparks off a flint. It was something quieter. He moved like a man who had crawled out of wreckage and wasn't afraid to show the smoke still clinging to his skin. His eyes scanned the crowd with a new weight, not heavy enough to crush, but heavy enough to demand attention without asking. When he cracked the first joke, it didn't bounce. It landed, thick with a truth that made people laugh harder because they knew somewhere under it, something real was breathing. Steve didn't hide from the pauses anymore. He let them stretch. He let silence sit between words, the way a fighter sizes up an opponent before the next blow. And when he spoke, not just the jokes, but the moments between the jokes, he spoke like a man who had learned the difference between making people laugh and making them feel alive again. Some moments on set didn't even feel scripted anymore. One day, a young contestant nervously stumbled over an answer, face burning, ready for the jokes to come. Steve simply chuckled, leaned over the podium and said, "Man, I've fallen harder than you just did." And I got up. So don't sweat it. It ain't the fall. It's the fight that counts. The room had burst into applause, not because the moment was perfect, but because it was true. It didn't stop there. Off the stage, the fire he had rebuilt inside him pushed outward into something bigger. Late at night, long after taping wrapped, Steve sat with that same battered notebook from months ago, the pages dog-eared and filled with scrawls that looked more like battle plans than jokes. He turned those notes into something more, a book that wasn't neat, wasn't clean, but bled with the hard-earned lessons he refused to keep to himself anymore. Jump. That was the title. No pretense. No promise of easy glory. Just the brutal truth. You can stay safe and stuck your whole life, or you can leap, terrified and broken and shaking, and find out you can fly anyway. The book didn't debut with polished fanfare or glittering champagne parties. It hit like a gut punch. Readers devoured it not because it offered formulas for success, but because it cracked open every quiet terror they had been too ashamed to name. Fear, regret, the whispered lies that tell you it's too late. Steve Harvey's Jump wasn't a self-help guide, it was a survival map, inked in sweat and mistakes and second chances. And the world noticed. Clips of Steve's speeches, raw, unscripted moments where he pulled no punches, started exploding across social media. Not the polished ones from years ago, where everything had a perfect setup and payoff. These were the ones where he stopped mid-joke, looked out into the crowd, and dropped a hammer of truth so heavy the room went dead silent before erupting in cheers. You broke? Good. You scared? Even better. That's the fuel, he growled into microphones, the sweat still shining on his brow, his voice cracking with something no studio lights could fake. The videos hit like shockwaves. Young dreamers sitting in tiny apartments, Blue-collar workers crushed by bills, old fighters who thought their time had passed, people who had nothing in common except the ache to believe again, shared those clips by the millions. They didn't just watch Steve Harvey, they saw themselves in him, broken, bruised, still standing, still daring. The old fans came back first, the ones who had laughed with him before the world turned on him, the ones who remembered the milk crate comic who refused to quit. They packed the comment sections, the book signings, the theater seats, their cheers louder now, their loyalty fiercer because they understood the cost of what they were witnessing. But it wasn't just the old guard. A new wave crashed in behind them. Young people who hadn't even known who Steve Harvey was when he first rose, but who recognized something universal in the way he stood tall after being knocked breathless. They didn't care about the old scandals. They didn't care about the headlines. They cared about the man who stood on stage, smiling with broken teeth and a steel spine, telling them, jump anyway, fall anyway, bleed anyway, but move, always move. It was never perfect. Some nights the cracks still showed, the hesitation in his voice, the slight stutter when the old doubts tried to worm their way back into his throat. But he didn't run from them anymore. He let the cracks breathe. He let them bleed out in front of whoever was watching, because that, he realized, was the real gift. Not pretending you never broke, showing you could break and still rebuild. People started calling it a comeback. They said he was back at the top. They said Steve Harvey had reclaimed his throne. But the truth, the raw, blood and bone truth that only he knew sitting in the quiet after the lights went out, was that he wasn't chasing a throne anymore. He was chasing freedom. Freedom from the need to be perfect. Freedom from the fear of falling. Freedom to be exactly who he had always been. Messy, human, stubborn as hell, and still rise. And rise he did. Steve Harvey, the man who once slept in a car with a torn jacket for a blanket, who once fled a stage under a hail of laughter and plastic cups, who once thought a single mistake had ended his story, became more than a name again. He became a living, breathing proof that scars don't disqualify you. They crown you. And in homes, schools, workplaces across the world, in quiet living rooms lit only by the glow of a cracked screen, people sat watching a man who refused to be buried by his own brokenness, and whispered words they hadn't dared believe for themselves in years. If he can get up, maybe I can too. And just like that, Steve Harvey became something even rarer than a star. He became a legend still in motion, a fighter still rising, a survivor still running straight into the storm, not to escape it, but to tear through it, fists swinging, scars shining like battle medals for the world to see. The world had watched him rise again from the ashes, but tonight, under the blinding lights of the Rise Again Gala, Steve Harvey stood not to claim a throne, but to thank the one who had handed him the match when all he had left was smoke. The ballroom glittered with polished marble floors, chandeliers throwing broken rainbows across velvet-draped tables, packed with the powerful, the famous, the survivors. Cameras flashed like nervous birds along the edges of the room, but the roar of conversation dulled into a low, restless hum as Steve Harvey took the stage. He was wearing a dark suit, sharp at the shoulders, no tie, just an open collar, a heartbeat visible at his throat. He didn't walk like a man parading toward applause. He walked like a man carrying something sacred and fragile in both hands. The microphone crackled slightly as he adjusted it, but Steve didn't flinch. He gripped the sides of the podium and let the silence stretch, long enough for the rustle of gowns and the shuffle of expensive shoes to settle into stillness. The faces staring back at him were hungry for a story, for a soundbite, for another polished victory speech. But Steve Harvey had not come here tonight to deliver a sermon about his own survival. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, almost rough, as if it had been dragged across a gravel and stitched back together. Tonight, he said, pausing, letting the weight of the room lean in, ain't about me. The crowd stirred, unsure. Steve's hand tapped the side of the podium once. A sharp, soft knock like a hammer falling somewhere deep. I thought my tank was empty, he continued, his voice cracking slightly around the edges, until I met a woman who showed me my reserve tank. A ripple ran through the audience, a breath catching between bodies dressed in designer armor. Steve's gaze swept across them, past the wealthy donors, past the celebrities, landing on a simple figure sitting near the front, Jasmine Crockett. She wore a black dress, simple as a prayer, no jewelry but a thin silver chain glinting at her throat. Her hands were folded calmly in her lap, her eyes steady, as if she already knew she wasn't the audience tonight. She was the reason it all mattered. Steve took another breath. It rattled a little in his chest but came out strong. "We live in a world that loves to build you up just to tear you down," he said. "It loves a winner until you trip. And when you trip, it don't ask if you're hurt. It don't ask if you're still breathing. It just steps over you and moves on." The room was utterly silent now. Even the waiters froze at the doors, silver trays suspended midair. Steve's voice lowered again, steady as a hammer. "I was almost one of the ones they stepped over." He paused, blinking hard against the sting behind his eyes. The lights blurred briefly, the ballroom warping into a swirl of gold and dark suits. Steve gripped the podium tighter, grounding himself in the wood under his palms. "But this woman right here," he said, jerking his chin slightly toward Jasmine, without turning fully to face her, "she didn't step over me." He let the words sink like anchors into the glossy floor. "She stopped. She knelt. She looked me dead in the eye when I couldn't look at myself. And she said, 'Your failure is not your funeral. It's your fertilizer.'" Murmurs stirred in the crowd now, low and reverent, like a congregation hearing gospel after a long drought. Steve's mouth twisted into a half smile, not polished for the cameras, but crooked and hard-earned. "She didn't save me because she needed a story. She didn't pull me up to get thanked. She didn't even know what it would cost her to hand me back my fire. And she did it anyway." Another pause, but this time the silence was not empty. It throbbed with something alive, something electric. Jasmine had not moved. Her eyes, steady and fierce, held his across the distance without blinking. "We throw around words like hero too easy these days," Steve said, his voice sharpening. "We call folks heroes for winning awards, for getting rich, for building empires." He leaned forward, the podium creaking slightly under his weight, his voice dropping to a growl that vibrated through the hall. "A hero ain't who wins the most. A hero's the one who finds you bleeding in the dirt and refuses to leave you there." He reached behind the podium, lifting a small velvet box with both hands. His fingers shook just slightly, not from weakness, but from the force of everything this moment carried. "Tonight, I'm giving something back," he said simply. Steve stepped forward, down from the safety of the stage lights, into the shadowed swell of the audience. He crossed the floor slowly, each step deliberate, unhurried. Jasmine rose to meet him without needing a cue. She stood straight, chin lifted, calm as a mountain in the middle of a storm. When Steve reached her, he opened the box with a careful thumb, revealing a silver medallion inside, heavy and unadorned except for one phrase engraved across its battered surface: "The Dream Defender." The applause started low. One, two people clapping hesitantly as the realization bloomed across the room. Then it built, rolling over the audience like a tide, until the chandeliers trembled with the force of it. Steve didn't speak again. He didn't need to. He simply placed the medal into Jasmine's hand, wrapped her fingers around it, and bowed his head in a silent salute that said more than any speech ever could. The cameras caught it, the handoff, the bow, the raw emotion carved into every line of Steve's face. The world would see it. The headlines would scream it tomorrow. But in that moment, inside that ballroom, heavy with breath and heart and memory, none of that mattered. What mattered was that for once, the world wasn't just celebrating the polished victory. It was honoring the bloody, broken, stubborn rise after the fall. The applause was still crashing around them, the cameras still flashing like desperate stars. But for Steve Harvey, there was only one moment left that mattered. The one where two broken fighters stood side by side, not as symbols, but as survivors. Steve Harvey turned fully now, facing Jasmine Crockett without the distance of stages or titles between them. The ballroom around them blurred, a shimmering mess of noise and light. But she remained steady at the center of it all, the way a mountain holds its ground against a storm. Steve stepped closer, the battered silver medallion still warm between their palms, where he had pressed it into her hand. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. The air between them was thick, humming with everything that had been fought for, everything that had almost been lost. Jasmine looked up at him, her eyes bright but dry, her spine straight as a blade forged in fire. Steve's hand, rough and calloused, reached out and found hers without hesitation, their fingers weaving together in a grip that was neither staged nor delicate. The moment wasn't polished for the cameras. Their hands weren't perfectly posed. Steve's grip was too tight, Jasmine's knuckles a little too white. But it was real. Real in the way that broken people recognize in each other the invisible battles no stage could ever show. The stage lights above them shifted, bathing them both in a soft gold that didn't blind but blessed, casting long, intertwined shadows onto the polished floor. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade, muffled and distant, like the roar of an ocean 1,000 miles away. They stood there, not as celebrity and activists, not as legend and rising star, but as two souls who had crawled through darkness and refused to let it win. Steve tightened his grip slightly, a small squeeze, a silent thank you, a promise carried in skin and bone. Jasmine squeezed back just once, enough to say without words, "We're not done fighting." They didn't raise their arms in victory. They didn't bow their heads in reverence. They just stood there, two weathered champions under the burn of golden light, breathing the same battered air, sharing the same brutal, beautiful truth. Survival was not enough. Survival had to mean something. In the corner of the ballroom, a photographer raised his camera, lens trembling in his hands. He captured the image, the simple press of hands, the fierce tilt of Jasmine's chin, the tired but unbroken set of Steve's jaw. And in that frame, the world outside caught a glimpse of something it rarely gets to see. Not the fall, not the fake redemption arc, but the hard, holy middle ground where people stand scarred but unbowed, daring the world to break them again. Steve leaned down slightly, enough so that only Jasmine could hear, and whispered, his voice low and rough, "This time, we don't just survive. We build." Jasmine's lips curved into a small, fierce smile that didn't touch her makeup, didn't soften her steel. She nodded once, sharp as a blade sliding home, sealing the vow between them. Around them, the crowd thundered back to life, rising to their feet in a standing ovation that shook the chandeliers overhead. But neither Steve nor Jasmine turned to soak in the cheers. They turned toward each other. They turned toward the fire. Steve felt the pressure of the moment settle into his bones, not as a burden, but as a mantle, heavy and right. He had spent so long chasing laughter, chasing light, chasing something to erase the scars he hated. But standing here, under the blaze of 1,000 golden bulbs, he understood at last. It was the scars that made the light mean something. It was the cracks that let it in. And it was the hands you reached for, when pride would have left you alone, that turned survival into victory. Their hands stayed clasped for a moment longer, the room spinning around them, time stretching thin and fragile. Steve could feel every callus on Jasmine's palm, every tremor in his own fingers, every heartbeat pounding against the fragile bones of their joined grip. This wasn't the end of a journey. It wasn't even the climax. It was the beginning of a new war, fought not with fists or microphones, but with the stubborn, breathtaking act of standing tall when every scar begged you to stay down. The lights flared higher, the air trembled under the weight of cheers, and still they stood, two storm-touched warriors holding the line against a world too quick to forget what real survival costs. When Steve finally loosened his grip, it wasn't out of surrender. It was out of a deeper strength, a silent understanding that neither of them needed to hold tighter anymore to stay standing. They had already won the only battle that mattered, the one inside the silent, bleeding parts of themselves the world never saw. Steve Harvey straightened, chest rising, face carved with the kind of tired joy that only those who have fallen understand. Jasmine Crockett stood beside him, unshaken, a living anthem of every soul who ever dared to get back up when the world gave them every reason to stay down. Together, under the fierce, holy burn of the lights, they turned to face the future, not waiting for it to be kind, not needing it to be easy. Just ready, just alive, just enough. As the golden lights faded and the crowd's roar blurred into a distant memory, What lingered in the heavy air between Steve Harvey and Jasmine Crockett wasn't applause. It was the echo of a deeper truth that no microphone, no stage, and no camera could ever fully capture. Because this story, this bloody, imperfect, aching climb back into the light, was never just about redemption. It wasn't about winning back fame or silencing critics. It wasn't even about proving anything to a world that forgets faster than it forgives. It was about something fiercer, something harder, the brutal, unglamorous reality that every soul carrying scars must face. Survival is not the end of the battle. Survival is just the first step in learning how to live again without pretending you were never broken. Steve Harvey's journey wasn't a glossy comeback fairy tale wrapped in neat bows and media campaigns. It was a battlefield littered with old shame, battered faith, and the wreckage of dreams that almost didn't survive the fall. It was a man crawling through the ash of his own failures to find, buried under it all, the stubborn ember that refused to die. It was the truth that sometimes your worst mistake, the one you think has erased your name from the world's memory, can become the soil where your fiercest strength grows. Not because the world suddenly decides to be fair, but because you decide that your story isn't finished yet. The human lesson carved into every moment of this story was painfully simple and brutally hard. You will fall. You will fail. You will be laughed at, torn down, betrayed, humiliated, and the injustice of it will tear at your ribs like a living thing. You can do everything right and still be left bleeding by people who once cheered your name. You can give the world everything you have and watch it spit you out the moment you become inconvenient. And no amount of talent, faith, or love can protect you from the breaking. But what defines a life, what separates the forgotten from the legendary, is not how bright you shine when everything goes right. It's how stubbornly you get up when everything goes wrong. It's how fiercely you refuse to let your failures become your funeral. It's the quiet, savage decision to use every scar as a weapon, every regret as a stepping stone, every humiliation as armor. Steve Harvey's real victory wasn't standing on that stage again. It wasn't the bestseller lists or the viral videos. It was sitting alone in the dark after the fall, hearing the old voices whisper he was done and whispering back, not yet. It was reaching out to someone like Jasmine Crockett, not from a place of strength, but from a place of utter nakedness, and finding that real strength was being willing to be seen broken and still keep walking anyway. It was learning that sometimes the hands that lift you don't come from the crowds that once cheered you, but from the few souls who understand the battlefield you carry inside your skin because they walk it too. And maybe most of all, it was realizing that the gift, the fire, that got you here was never about the trophies. It was never about the validation. It was about what you could build when no one was watching, when no one believed, when all you had left was breath and grit and the bloody fingerprints of every time you clawed your way back from the edge. That's the real message. That's the real battle. And it belongs to every soul who has ever thought they were finished because the world told them so. Every soul who curled up in the cold and thought they were alone. Every soul who stood on a broken stage, feeling the weight of 1,000 invisible knives pressing against their skin. Every soul who stayed silent when the shame got too loud. And every soul who somehow still dared to get back up even when it hurt. This story is not just Steve Harvey's story. It's the story of anyone who has ever been broken, anyone who has ever been told they are too late, too old, too scarred, too small. Anyone who has ever believed for one terrible moment that failure was a tombstone instead of a milestone. And in that final moment, standing under the fierce, righteous fire of the lights, Steve Harvey and Jasmine Crockett gave the world something infinitely more valuable than a comeback. They gave it proof. Proof that you can be broken and still breathe. Proof that you can be betrayed and still believe. Proof that you can lose everything and still find something inside you worth fighting for. They stood there hand in hand, not as the picture of perfection, but as living testaments to the hard, brutal, breathtaking truth. Falling is human, rising is a choice, and the choice to rise, again and again and again, is what carves legends out of mortals. The stage lights eventually dimmed. The applause faded into history. The cameras shut off. But somewhere, maybe in a hospital room, where a dream had just slipped through tired fingers, maybe in a cramped apartment where the bills stacked higher than the hope, maybe in a cracked mirror where a familiar face asked if they could survive one more day. Someone remembered. Someone whispered, maybe me too. And in that whisper, in that ragged, stubborn breath, the world moved just a little closer to being saved. Not by heroes in capes, but by the broken, by the scarred, by the stubborn, furious dreamers who refuse to let failure have the last word. Just like Steve Harvey, just like Jasmine Crockett, just like anyone who dares to rise when the world begs them to stay fallen. Because surviving isn't enough. Hoping isn't enough. In a world built to grind down dreamers and bury them under silence, the only thing that changes anything is action. So if something inside you stirred as you heard this story, if something deep and stubborn lit up in your bones, then don't you dare ignore it. Don't you dare let it flicker out under the cold breath of doubt. This is not the time to sit back and wait for the world to hand you a second chance. It won't. It never has. It never will. This is the time to seize it, teeth clenched, heart hammering against your ribs like a drum calling you to battle. This is the time to remember that you were not built for permission. You were not built to survive quietly. You were built to burn, to blaze, to tear holes in the sky with the sheer audacity of your refusal to quit. Stand up now, not when you feel ready, not when the fear goes away, but right now, shaking and scarred and scared if you have to be. Stand up for the dreams you locked away because someone told you that your time had passed. Stand up for the version of you that almost gave up in the dark. Stand up for the ones who are watching you, needing you to believe so they can believe too. Because the truth is brutal but simple. Someone out there is waiting for you to rise so they remember it's possible. Fight not for the applause but for the fire. Fight for the boy who slept in a broken car, for the girl who was laughed off the stage, for every soul that was told they weren't enough. Carry their weight with you, not as a burden, but as proof that you are part of something bigger, something older, something harder to kill than fear itself. Let the world see your scars and call them stories. Let it see your brokenness and call it beauty. Let it hear your trembling voice and understand that courage doesn't sound like thunder. It sounds like breath drawn in defiance when the world tries to smother you. Be the hand that reaches back for someone else, the voice that calls another fighter back to the front lines. Stop waiting to feel fearless. Stop waiting for permission. There will never be a perfect moment. There is only now, this messy, bloody, terrifying now. And what you do inside it will echo longer than any safe, silent life you could build behind locked doors. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.